Why innocents confess? I know it sounds hard to believe, especially if we're not familiar with some of these most important cases where innocents have confessed. However, it is true. Some innocent people have confessed to the worst imaginable crimes, even homicide. So, welcome back guys, and welcome to this channel and to this video. And today, as you have understood, we are going to talk about confessions, specifically confessions made, rendered by people who are actually innocent. The first important case we are going to treat today is that of 1955, when Darrell Parker confessed to the crime of having killed his wife. Actually having raped and then killed his wife. And it is like that the new technique, the read technique to confess or to make people confess came about. Darrell Parker was brought into this room where there was an investigator, a detective, John Reed. John Reed, who had been part of the police and at the time was part of the police, was very well renowned in the field or among his colleagues for this success rate in making people confess. So he at the time was part of the police, and he had developed this technique where initially it was just a confrontation. It was just a conversation about what had happened, where the person, the suspect, had been during the time of the crime, and so on and so forth, right? But then gradually, in 9 steps, because these were elaborated as 9 precise steps, the word of the suspect would not be taken into consideration progressively more and more. And basically what would happen is that the suspect was going to deny the right to actually deny what was the alleged crime he was accused of, and the questions were modulated not to understand really what had happened, but more to make him confess. So for instance, rather than asking where the suspect had been, John Reed would leave the room and then come back and say that the evidence pointed out towards him or her being the culprit. And for instance, rather than asking what did you spend the money on using that specific credit card, John Reed would ask, what did you buy? And then after 20 attempts, somebody might say actually the right thing, as we'll see. So the technique was also developed in a way to minimize the crime, right? So if it had been rape, for instance, John Reed would kind of like being empathetic with the suspect, and so say stuff like that woman was dressed in a particular way, and the usual excuses that are part of the myth of accepting rape. Or if it had been somebody stealing money, the excuse would be they don't pay you enough, or they deserved it, or we know you're a good guy, you're a good person, or a good woman for that matter, and you did it because you're struggling financially, right? And so some of this theory is still applied by policemen, when they are looking for a confession, because a confession is the queen proof or that piece of evidence in front of which everything else, including DNA evidence, gets neglected. And so in order to get that confession, almost everything is admissible. And so Darrell Parker actually ended up confessing to a crime he had not committed, spent some time in jail, and then went out of the jail, and then after a few years he found out that somebody 10 years before his release had actually confessed. The lawyers made the confession of the actual culprit public only when the culprit, who had been already in jail, died. And so Darrell Parker sued the state of Nebraska and was, you know, free with that stigma, though, right? And with some money. I think it was like $500,000 he got from the lawsuit, but still with the stigma of having raped and killed his wife. Now, the read technique was, from that point onwards, more and more used, not only by the read company, but also by policemen. And that is basically how we ended up having an amount of confessions from people that are actually innocent. Now, a turning point was 1966. 1966 because that was the year of the deliberation of the Supreme Court in the case against Miranda. And we all know now that when somebody gets arrested or is formally suspected, he has to be informed of his rights. And that is actually what was denied to Miranda, who sued, won, but eventually still ended up in prison because he was convicted for the crime. Now, even though there was that turning point, and even though like people are informed of their rights, some innocent people still confess. Why? Well, there are many factors that might play into that sort of decision. First of all, people that are young and people that are more mentally fragile will still end up confessing. At least what has been noticed is that they first deny. During like a couple of days, maybe a week, they will end up confessing, and immediately after confession, they will recant their own confession. Part of the strategy is when the confession is rendered to write down that confession. And what John Reed would do in this 9 steps of his technique is actually to write down the confession with smaller details so that the suspect would read it and correct. Now, the correction of those mistakes will prove in a court of law that he knew and he was aware and he had not been manipulated, and that's how and the proof of that is that he actually corrected his mistakes. So there's a whole strategy here deployed to make people confess, but this strategy is playing on people's feelings. For instance, if you are innocent and you are convinced that eventually this will come into light, what you do is you might give up. You might not tolerate that sort of pressure, and you might confess with the idea of going back home, going away from that room, ending the nightmare you're living, right? So people that are actually convinced that this will soon finish and the moment you confess are the same people who will render a false confession and confessing to crimes they have not committed. So another case was that in 1994, the detective at the time was James Trainham, and he was convinced using the read technique that a woman was the culprit of a murder. The murder specifically of an employee working for Voice of America. However, even though the woman ended up confessing, and this is the case where she guessed after 20 attempts that she had bought shrimps with the credit card, even though she ended up confessing, I was saying, she was actually innocent. She had such a strong alibi that cannot be put in doubt. And that is how James Trainham realized that the read technique was not so accurate. It would get you a confession, it would get somebody to confess, but that confession might have been completely false and completely coerced. Similarly, the case of the 5 in Central Park in New York, 4 African American and 1 Hispanic were accused of raping a woman. They also reported to having stabbed her, which was not the case. And as we all know, they were released because the confession was false. At the time, the 5 in Central Park were basically teenagers, and there was no other piece of evidence but their own confession. One of the most important experts that has studied confessions, and specifically false confession, is Saul Casey. And in reading the read technique, what he realized is that the system was extremely coercive, and it was a series of strategies displayed for people to feel guilty and create kind of new memories based off the information that was released and given by the policeman. And one important piece into this puzzle is that the policemen are better than average people at recognizing lies, however, not so great at recognizing when somebody is telling the truth. And that's probably, you know, some form of deformation that comes with the job of having to suspect people on a regular basis, having to mistrust what they say. So for instance, one of the hints given by the Reed company, because John Reed ended up creating his own company on, making people confess. One of the techniques was to watch the video of the interrogation without the audio. But something that has been found is that actually the audio is important. Not only the body posture and the movements, like the gestures that somebody can make when speaking, but also the audio, what people say, the tone of voice. Also that might communicate a degree of either pain or distress, or being manipulated into saying something that actually did not happen. But interestingly, the experiments that ended up proving that innocent people might confess also understood something, that when somebody is accused of something, it could be even something small, but when somebody is accused of something that's either illegal or immoral, in the attempt of either denying or confessing, there's an internalization of guilt. And this plays an important role, because somebody might get either convinced through the creation of a false memory, and that's more of an elaborated process, but still a process that can happen, or they might not be convinced of having committed a crime they have not committed, but they can still confess to it because also of that sense of guilt, which is paradoxical since they have not committed it, but also interesting how the human mind would work in that sort of process. Interesting because also people that were told not to have done something might actually deny it, might actually say that that is a way for the experimenter to justify their actions, right? So it's interesting because not having guilt at all would mean most likely that you lack of empathy. But guilt can also be very much a counterproductive sort of tool that will make you do dumbest things, like for instance confessing to something you have not committed. Alright, guys, with that being said, I want to know your thoughts. Have you ever confessed to something you have not committed? Not necessarily a crime, but something you have not done. And what was the reason? Was that to cover somebody else? Was that because you felt guilty regardless? And has guilt ever led you to a place that you actually regret? So let me know your comments, comment below, and if you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll talk next time in a new video. Bye!